Hi, and welcome to the CDFM study group. My name is Helen Thomas. We are going to be covering CDFM Module 2.2, Cost and Economic Analysis, and we will pick up on page 2.2.10. So we recently looked at the acquisition program, where we look at the three activities, the three milestones, and the five phases. And we looked at what happened at each one of those phases. At the top of page 10, now we're looking at the relationship between the acquisition phases and the type of funding that is required. Funding equals appropriation. So the chart at the top is very good. And what I did in my study notes is I wrote the type of appropriation. I went back to page 8 and page 9, and to the right of the paragraph, I wrote the type of funding associated with that phase. For instance, acquisition phase, the first phase. So 5 phases. So material solution analysis. So what it's saying here is you utilize RDT&E, research development, technology and equipment, funding, or potentially O&M. So you can use RDT&E and sometimes some O&M funds to do the material solution analysis. So I went back to page 2.2.8, and to the right, I wrote RDT&E or O&M funds. So when I'm studying, I would then associate, once I study and I go back over the material, this is what you need to do, is then once you look at the material solution analysis phase, you need to then tie in the type of funding. So you kind of cover 2 pages at the same time. So technology development is strictly RDT&E funding. Engineering and manufacturing development is RDT&E and procurement. Production and deployment requires procurement and military construction funding. And your operation and support requires O&M and MILPERS. So next to each one of those phases, of your 5 phases, to the right, you need to put down the type of appropriation required for each one of those phases. So that'll take care of the top of page 10. The bottom of page 10, that last paragraph, let me see, I have some things highlighted here. So because approval to enter into the engineering phase, milestone B, is normally considered program initiation, because we already just learned that, of the acquisition program, it is appropriate. Initiation of the acquisition program, it is appropriate the new program management office prepare input for the next POM best cycle. So once they determine that now we're going into the actual acquisition program process system at milestone B, then that program manager responsible for that function, because every function in DoD is assigned to a particular PMO, program management office, will then prepare the appropriation document necessary to request, let's see, we said procurement money and military construction funding. All right, so that shows you relationship between acquisition and phases and your funding. And you can read through the others. All right, so page 11 is, some of this is repetitive, but it's good. That's what makes it easier, is when you repeat these things. Because I know I only covered the first part, was page 5 through 9, but it took over 30 minutes just to talk about the information that's there. So repetitiveness is good. Repeating and going over the process is better for you to understand the information. So acquisition milestone. Technically, the DoD acquisition management system may be entered at any of the multiple points. So they do not have to go from pre-systems acquisition, systems acquisition, operation and support. They won't have to go through each one of those phases. So that's what it's saying. That's the reason we have the acquisition system. Sometimes they may enter into a different phase based on what's needed. So the DoD acquisition system, providing there's an affirmative approval, material development decision, and necessary entrance criteria are met, then they can enter whatever phase is necessary at the time. So don't get the idea that you have to start from pre-systems acquisition all the way to operation and support. That's determined by the Milestone Decision Authority. Each milestone is a decision point evaluated by both the Joint Requirements Oversight Council. That's what we talked about. The individuals, the group that's in charge of JCIDs, the ones that said, this is what's necessary, this is our capability gap, these are the things that we need to be able to do to fulfill and provide to the warfighter to get the job done. So that's the job of the JROC, Joint Requirements Oversight Council. Who is the chairman of the JROC? The vice chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. And the Milestone Decision Authority. So the JROC is talking to the Milestone Decision Authority. And who is the Milestone Decision Authority for major defense programs? And we're going to touch a little bit more on that in the near future. That's your Undersecretary of Defense, USD ATNL, Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics. So the bottom on page 11, milestone A, it gives you a quick snapshot again, one path into the acquisition system, or looking at your alternatives. This part starts with a decision at milestone A, authorized entry into technology development. Does not equal program initiation. Which one does? Milestone B. So a successful milestone B is to authorize entry into the engineering and manufacturing phase. Programs that enter the acquisition process at these milestones are required to have a system operational architecture. The milestone usually at the point at which program initiation occurs. When milestone B occurs, the military department or the PMO we just talked about, Program Management Office responsible for that program, is required to have adequate fundings in the Future Year Defense Program. That's what FYDP stands for. And we talked about Future Year Defense Program. I think it's what that was actually in Module 1. But your Future Year Defense, the Section 1 I meant. So Section 1, so FYDP, Future Year Defense Program, that's the DoD database that ties together our resources, our requirements, and it's utilized to then request the appropriate funding. And milestone C, that's where it talks about approves the acquisition strategy, full development, full deployment, and are documented in the acquisition decision memorandum. So page 12, the DoD directive we talked about, 5000.01, talks about the acquisition system, says that a system must have flexibility, responsiveness, innovation, discipline, streamline, and effective management. You can read through that on your own. Then it continues acquisition policy objectives. I'm not going to look at that. Page 14 talks about the DODI 5000.02, which is the operation, the process of the defense acquisition system. And it must have that evolutionary acquisition. So the preferred DoD strategy for rapid acquisition, that's going back to what I said, is you do not have to start from technology development all the way, because if there's already a similar technology that was already developed, you may simply be given approval to go into engineering or actually deploying those production and deployment. All right, we're getting ready to gear up for some more fun stuff on page 2.2.15, the defense acquisition categories. So you have guidebook that's listed at the top. It's just saying that you have instructions, information provided in defense acquisition guidebook. But I want to talk about the acquisition categories. So every major purchase based on the cost, based on the severity of that particular item that is being purchased. And it's typically either a weapon system, or a information system, something in general. But just think of millions, billions of dollars contracts are usually those types of systems. So all of these acquisition program items are broken down into different categories. Those that are handled at the DoD level. So let's first look at acquisition category 1. Which is listed in the middle of the slide. All your acquisition category 1 are a major defense acquisition program. That is then, and it designates, so the bottom of page 15, designates the highest level defense acquisition program. So it makes sense. Those are the most expensive costs for the Department of Defense. So depending on however the threshold, and it's listed here, if it's RDT&E more than 365 million and so forth, they have costs. But the bottom line is the milestone decision authority for all acquisition categories are your acquisition executives. So let's start by looking at the slide, and then we'll take it on the other page. So the second slide to the right then says acquisition category 1 Delta means your milestone decision authority. That's the individual that's in charge of each one of those decision reviews that we talked about. Your MDA, milestone decision authority, is the senior person that's saying, yes, go ahead. No, we need to stop right here. So if it's an acquisition category 1 Delta, that means it's a defense-related contract, a defense-related material solution. So D behind the acquisition category is what will tell you it's a defense level. And if it's a defense level, it's telling you that the milestone decision authority, known as a defense acquisition executive, is the one in charge. Now, I'm going to also tell you while we're here that another title for the Defense Acquisition Executive is the USD AT&L. And let me see if I have it here where I can show it to you. And I think it's in the slide. So you see the USD AT&L mentioned numerous times there, designated by the USD AT&L because of special interest, cost. The acquisition category 1 Charlie with a C behind it. C means component. So for most people associated with the Army, they're thinking, okay, should it be 1A? This should be an A for Army. No, the C means component. So any service component, their senior leader acquisition executive will then be the milestone decision authority for their process. So not every acquisition system goes and is handled directly at DoD level. Only the acquisition category 1 Delta. So those are your general type of purchases. When you go to page 16, you see there's another acquisition category. So we talk about acquisition category 1, and then the subcategories is acquisition category 1 Delta for the defense level, DoD level, and 1 Charlie for your component level. It just means who's the milestone decision authority. But page 16, the other acquisition category, when you deal with information system, computer system. So anything information system related is an acquisition category 1A, A for automation. And that's what's listed on the slide, and we'll look at it at the bottom again. But to the right of it, so there's subcategories to your acquisition category 1A. 1A tells you automation. So the MDA, the Milestone Decision Authority, the DEA, Defense Acquisition Executive, or your DoD CIO, that's your signal folks, your information folks, designates the major acquisition, major automated information system programs as either, so they designate whether that program is acquisition category 1AM or acquisition category 1AC. So look, 1AM is the DoD level one. So if it's IAM, ACAT 1 IAM, that's DoD level, so that's equivalent to the D we did. Acquisition category 1D and acquisition category 1AM for automation is at the DoD level. Says the same thing. So an acquisition category I or 1AC is your component level information system. So automation at the component level. When MDA is at the component level, C indicates component. MDA is either the component head or their designated component acquisition executive, CAE. And all of that is listed. So the paragraphs, acquisition category 1 program subcategories, it shows you the 1 Delta is at the DoD level. Specifically, see now they talk about the USD ATNL, who is also known as a Defense Acquisition Executive. Do not get confused when they use different titles, just like we hold different titles. I'm a mother, I'm a sister, I'm a brother, I'm a whatever, father, yeah, you get the gist of what I'm saying. So acquisition category, for your acquisition category 1, major systems. If it's 1 Delta, that tells me that's the DoD level, is the Milestone Decision Authority. If it's at the DoD level, that also tells me the Defense Acquisition Executive is the one in charge, or the USD ATNL. Acquisition category 1 Charlie is at the component level, and the component acquisition executive is that individual that's in charge of those levels. So going back to the automation, if it's an automation, acquisition category 1A, still a 1, but the A says automation. At the top, acquisition category 1AM is your defense level. Your milestone decision authority can be your USD ATNL, or if it designates your chief information officer, your CIO, since they deal with automation, he may designate them as the milestone decision authority. Acquisition category 1 AC, automation 1. So acquisition category 1, that's a defense program. A, C, so automation component is the milestone decision authority. So let's look at page 17 at the top, where it starts with the MAIS programs will not be designated as ACAT 2. However, an AIS program that is not an acquisition information system, that is not a major acquisition system, may be designated as ACAT 3 by the CAE. All that's saying is, just like you have acquisition category 1, there's also acquisition category 2 and 3. What this is saying, major acquisition program will not be designated as an ACAT 2. Makes sense because I already told you if it's a major program, automatically it's an acquisition category 1. However, an automation information system is not a major acquisition information system program, may be designated as ACAT 3 if it's at the component level. So yeah, let's see. So we had information, major automation information system. So we're talking about the automation still. So if it's just a regular, so the AIS is equivalent to the ACAT 1 AC. So at that level, they may, and if it's not a major, then they may designate it as an ACAT 3. All right, let me leave that alone. All right, exception to policy. So the component acquisition executive. So I said, if it says component, that means your senior acquisition person at Army, senior acquisition person at the Air Force, Navy, and so forth. However, this is saying the CAE is a single official within a DoD component who's responsible for all acquisition functions within that component. This includes service acquisition executives for the military departments and acquisition executives in other specified DoD components. However, there are 2 components, the U.S. Special Operations Command and Defense Logistics Agency have been given specific acquisition management responsibility. That simply means they have been granted the right to approve, disapprove their own acquisition management. I'm sure there are limitations and dollar amounts and so forth, and they have to submit reports. All right, let's move on to page 2.2.18. At the top, it says Acquisition Program Baseline. So think of the beginning of this whole acquisition system. They had the initial capabilities document to kind of say what it is that is needed. And then we also have a acquisition program baseline. A baseline is that starting number, that expected operational capability, your cost, your price, your objectives. So let's look at this. To comply with legal requirements, the DODI 5000.02, which talks about the operations of the Defense Acquisition System, requires that every acquisition program establish an acquisition program baseline to document cost, schedule, and performance objectives and thresholds of that program beginning at program initiation. So you can kind of look at this baseline as a document that is developed early on before we even start development. So this is probably part of the analysis of when we did the technology analysis. You need to know what's your baseline. Where are we starting from? How do you determine what the cost is for the items or what exactly needs to be developed? So program baseline, whenever you hear program, most likely you know the next who does it, who's the one that creates the baseline. Program managers. Program managers are supposed to be the subject matter expert on those programs. So the baseline is created as part of the requirement to be created so that your milestone decision authority, they can't just make a decision. They need a starting point. So the starting document, the capability document, your program baseline, and there, as you will see as we go along, there are actually additional documents that's all part of that process that's being reviewed to ensure we're talking taxpayers' dollars that are very limited, so they need to ensure that they are meeting the objectives. Because look at the top of page 19. We briefly talked about the analysis of the alternatives or the courses of action, but we're going to touch on it and get a little bit more. So it says examination of the DoD acquisition management system life cycle chart indicates that one of the first decisions relative to that process is preparation of the initial capabilities document. We've already talked about that document that says, hey, this is what we need to fill that gap. So it sets forth the broad time phase operational goals and descriptions of the required capabilities. Not reading all that to fill the gap. The ICD may indicate both material and non-material, and we say they look at the .MLPF, the doctrine, the training, and all of that. And if it's deemed that the best solution is a material solution, that is what triggers initiation of the acquisition process. It doesn't mean we've entered into the program, but it starts that process. So you go into the pre-systems acquisition phase of it. So an analysis of alternative is your comparison. Course of action, you think of what you do. These are all my courses. What are my pros? What are my cons? Which one's better? What am I trying to accomplish? DoD instruction 5000.02 requires an AOA for acquisition category 1 and acquisition category 1A. Those are the ones that are handled at the DoD level. So we need to have your courses of actions done, analysis of alternative at major milestones. So it's a continuous process at the full rate production decision point and at such other times that's required by the milestone decision authority. A key in that fourth paragraph, and we've talked about in the first competency, the budget process, we talked about the director of CAPE, the one that's in charge of updating the future year defense program, the same one that's in charge of the programming phase of PEEV is also responsible for the preparation of the analysis of alternative study guidance. Again, because you think about a cost analysis, why not have your cost person being in charge of it, being responsible for giving the guidance to do the cost study? Okay, so you can read through the rest of that. So that's pulling out all the pertinent information. All right, another document that is listed early on in the process. So let's see. Cost analysis requirement description. So as be required by the DODI 5000 series, a card shall be prepared for, again, your acquisition. So we need acquisition program baseline, we need analysis of alternative, and we need a card. Cost analysis requirements description shall be prepared in acquisition category 1 and your 1A programs. DoD components sponsoring the acquisition program is responsible for preparing the card in coordination with the appropriate IPD. And we'll look at what that is in a minute. The card should be considered a living document because it's always being updated. DoD 5000.02 specifies the card will be prepared, here we go, for acquisition category 1 programs at program initiation for ships and prepared, updated at milestone B, milestone C, and your full rate of production decision review. For an acquisition category 1A, so you got to take it in pieces, a card should be prepared. So you got two requirements. If it's just your 1A programs, that means it's your aircrafts, your vehicles, those are your ones. The card is prepared and updated at milestone B, C, and full rate production. For your 1A or your automation program, the card should be prepared anytime an economic analysis is required by either statute or by the milestone decision authority. Timelines. I'm still in that paragraph, that first bullet on page 20. A draft version of the card is required 180 days prior to the milestone or the decision review. And the follow-on, the final version, is required 45 days prior to the milestone or decision review. Preparation of the card should be synchronized with other program documents, such as the acquisition program baseline, acquisition strategy, approved capability needs documents, analysis of the alternatives, and other contract documents. So all final program documentation is consistent at the time of the milestone decision review. Last paragraph. The card describes the basic technical, programmatic, and operational characteristics of the acquisition program to include realistic assessment of program risk, measures being planned or taken to mitigate those risks. So that's identifying your card. So with all of these, like the program baseline, know what's required in the baseline. Analysis of the alternative. What is it trying to accomplish? Your card, your cost analysis requirements document. So that's our program team. Let's see what else. All right, top of page 21. Preparation of the card is whose responsibility? Program managers. So again, if it talks about specific technical, operational baseline, that's your program manager is in charge of that. Or the other designated, let's see, a program manager falls under and works for a program executive officer, your PEO. And an authority no lower than the DoD component PEO shall approve the card. So hierarchy-wise, you have your PEO, and your PEO under them have different selected program managers. So the program manager prepares the card and the baseline, and the PEO approves it, is what it's saying. Because the card is a programmatic technical document rather than a cost estimate, the cost analysis in the program office would not actually prepare the document. However, a senior cost analyst in the office should review the card before it is submitted to the director of CAPE. So although he's responsible, he's not the one, and it makes sense. Just like we are budget analysts supporting your training folks, supporting your different sections, is if you're the subject matter expert, you should be the one doing the actual legwork. And then it's reviewed by the program executive officer who approves the card to go and be submitted to the director of CAPE, the DCAPE. So let's go back, let's recap. So your cost analysis requirements description, your card, it says it's prepared by your program manager, and that particular document, the card should be considered a living document. We looked at that. We also said that the DoD component sponsoring the acquisition program is responsible for preparing the card in coordination with the appropriate IPT. Oh, yes, and that's the integrated product team. So integrated with trying to make sure that everything still falls in line. Timeline, 180 days is my draft version. 45 days before the decision review, I need to complete that card. And make sure that you understand this is done in the beginning alongside when you do your analysis of alternatives, when you do your card, acquisition program baseline, you have all of these. The ICD is initial capability document. All of that is done in the initial stages of this whole process.